We did drugs together. There was no moment where I introduced her to anything. She already knew what she knew about drugs. At 56 years old, Bobby Brown finally sat in front of cameras and said the sentence no one wanted to hear, and even fewer were ready to believe. I wasn't the one who started it. For decades, the story most people clung to was simple: Bobby Brown dragged Whitney Houston down. He was the chaos. She was the fallen angel. It was an easy narrative, clean, moral, and satisfying. But this documentary starts in the space where that belief cracks. Their story does not begin with mugshots, police reports, or tabloid headlines. It begins quietly out of frame backstage at the Soul Train Music Awards in 1989, far away from the red carpet and the choreographed applause. 3 years later, on their wedding day in 1992, Bobby claims he saw something that shattered the fairy tale version of Whitney before it ever had a chance to exist. A single moment he says he carried in silence for more than 2 decades. For over 20 years, the world needed a villain. Bobby Brown fit the role perfectly. Loud, defiant, arrested, easy to blame. Meanwhile, the more complicated truth stayed buried under headlines, public assumptions, and a profitable myth. Then came the ending everyone remembers. February 11, 2012. Whitney Houston found dead in a hotel bathroom in Beverly Hills, leaving behind not only grief but a trail of unanswered questions that most people were too comfortable to ask. That is where this documentary begins. Not to absolve Bobby Brown, not to shift all blame, but to confront a disturbing possibility. If Whitney was already spiraling long before the public saw it, who actually failed to protect her? And when Bobby Brown finally speaks now, is he revealing the truth or simply trying to find a way to live with? The fated meeting and 2 colliding worlds, 1989. Every documentary has a moment where everything quietly starts. Not with sirens, not with breaking news, with a room, a date. 2 people who were never supposed to meet this way. For Bobby Brown and Whitney Houston, that moment arrived on November 21, 1989, inside the Shrine Auditorium home of the Soul Train Music Awards. On the surface, it was all celebration. Cameras sweeping across the crowd, velvet seats lined in rows, spotlights carving through the darkness. Soul Train wasn't just another show. It was a controlled showcase designed to display black excellence in its most polished form, sharp, smooth, safe. Nothing messy was meant to leak beyond the frame. Backstage, it was different. The cameras stopped. The rules loosened. The air was thicker, more human. That was where the real story began. At that point in time, Whitney Houston did not belong to herself. She belonged to an image. America's sweetheart. The perfect voice. The immaculate face. Every movement approved. Every smile weighed for impact. Her team guarded her like a high-value asset, rather than a person. She was expected to be warm, gracious, unshakable, and she was exceptional at delivering exactly that. Too exceptional. On the other end of that same corridor stood Bobby Brown, freshly out of New Edition, already stamped with a reputation trouble. Loud, unfiltered, restless. He didn't walk with a protective entourage curated by a major label. He moved with an energy that made executives tense when he entered a space. Where Whitney's presence calmed boardrooms and reassured investors, Bobby's history raised questions. She represented control. He represented risk. 2 brands, 2 worlds. Perfect opposites. Backstage that night, the shrine wasn't polished. It was chaotic. Assistants rushed by, clutching clipboards and headsets. Producers shouted cues over the thud of bass bleeding through the walls. The hallway smelled like sweat, perfume, hairspray, and cigarette smoke. It was loud, disorganized, yet strangely intimate, a place where masks sometimes slipped. And somewhere in that corridor, according to Bobby's later accounts, and echoed by multiple witnesses, Whitney stepped out of her orbit. She approached him first, not with a dramatic entrance, not for show, Just a quiet step forward in a space where people were not used to seeing her initiate anything. No press cameras nearby. No publicist dragging her back. Just an unscripted moment. That detail matters because it cuts straight across the story. People later preferred the one where Bobby chased corrupted or invaded something pure. Those who were there described something else. Whitney looked tired, restless, curious in a way she rarely allowed herself to be seen. Bobby looked caught off guard, not hunting, not predatory, but amused, alert, and oddly understanding, as if he recognized the look in her eyes. They spoke briefly at first, then longer than anyone expected. Not about record deals, not about chart positions, about pressure, about being watched, about what it feels like to be told who you're supposed to be every time you walk into a room. Their connection in that moment wasn't built on romance or physical attraction. It was built on recognition. Whitney had spent years surrounded by people whose survival depended on her staying perfect. Bobby had spent years surrounded by people who fully expected him to crash. In each other they didn't see a project. They saw an exit route, not out of fame but out of the roles fame had forced onto them. She didn't recoil from his reputation. He didn't put her on an unreachable pedestal. That alone made the interaction dangerous. Witnesses remembered Whitney laughing more than usual, laughing with her guard lowered. They remembered Bobby listening more than he was known to. The scene didn't feel like two stars flirting for attention. It felt like two people finally exhaling. And when you've been holding your breath for too long, that kind of relief can feel addictive. From that night on, their connection did not erupt into front-page stories. It simmered. Quiet phone calls. Private hangouts far from cameras. Shared spaces where the volume of the outside world dropped. With him, Whitney wasn't America's sweetheart. With her, Bobby wasn't the industry's problem child. For a few hours at a time, they were simply two people with their shoulders unknotting in the same room. This is where the first hidden layer appears. In old R&B message boards and long-buried discussions, countless fans and insiders have pointed out something the official narratives often skip. Whitney was already looking for a place to be herself in 1989, not just after the wedding, not just after the scandals. Her public image didn't leave space for rage, doubt, or rebellion. Bobby Brown embodied all three. That didn't make him a savior. It made him a mirror. And mirrors, when you've been carefully posed your whole life, can be dangerously hard to look away from. Between late 1989 and the early 1990s, people close to Whitney noticed small shifts. Nothing tabloid-ready, just slight changes. She pushed back a little more in meetings. She stayed longer in casual conversations that weren't on the schedule. She gravitated toward rooms where her name didn't automatically freeze the atmosphere. Bobby, for his part, sometimes dialed himself down when she was around, less explosive, less performative. For once, he didn't need to prove anything. Still, no one around them wanted to put words to what they were seeing. The industry didn't have a clean box for this kind of pairing. Whitney's camp feared it would stain her carefully built brand. Bobby's side assumed it would burn out quickly. Both underestimated how deep this connection would run. The uncomfortable truth is this: what began that night backstage was not some classic love at first sight romance. It was escape. Two people suffocating under completely different pressures found oxygen in the same conversation. Once you've taken that kind of breath, you don't forget it. By the time the show ended and the audience streamed out of the Shrine Auditorium, they believed they'd just seen another flawless celebration of black music. They had no idea that backstage a line had been crossed, not physically but emotionally. A connection had been activated that would refuse to stay contained. Years later, people would argue who chased whom, who influenced whom, who ruined whom. But those questions missed the point. The real danger of that night wasn't attraction. It was permission. Permission to drop the mask. Permission to quietly rebel. Permission to feel seen without being controlled. Once that permission existed, there was no going back. The real story does not truly begin with the wedding or with the first headline. It starts on November 21, 1989 backstage at Soul Train, when two tightly managed worlds collided, and neither Bobby Brown nor Whitney Houston ever completely became who they were before that night again. The good girl and the truth inside 1991. By 1990, the image of Whitney Houston that America believed in had hardened into something almost sacred. She was the good girl of pop and R&B, the safe voice, the immaculate star. The smile parents trusted. The presence executives counted on. Every television appearance, every magazine cover, every award show, performance repeated the same message: discipline, elegance, control. But behind that curtain, a different reality had started to push through. The years between 1990 and 1991 should have been simple victory laps. Whitney was touring and recording I'm Your Baby Tonight, an album meant to modernize her sound, push her closer to gritty contemporary R&B, while still preserving the pristine brand that had made her a global icon. On stage, her voice remained almost untouchable. But offstage, the cracks were widening. This was the period when Bobby Brown became a steady presence in her life, and it's also the period most people misunderstand. In his memoir and several interviews, Bobby made a claim that shocked many. Whitney, he said, had already been using drugs before their relationship turned romantic. He did not paint himself as innocent. He openly admitted his addiction was more obvious, more chaotic, and harder to hide. But he refused the narrative that he was the one who introduced her to that world. I didn't teach her, he insisted. I didn't start her. That distinction is uncomfortable, but it matters, because it forces us to revisit the timeline. If Whitney was already experimenting or coping with substances around 1990, then the problem didn't arrive with Bobby. It arrived with pressure. By the early 90s, Whitney's life was scheduled nearly down to the minute. Tours stacked. Press runs scripted. Even in spaces without cameras, her behavior was watched. People close to her later described an existence where spontaneity was treated as risk, frustration as disobedience, and visible doubt as weakness. The good girl was more than a slogan. It was a cage built and reinforced daily by people whose jobs depended on keeping it intact. Bobby lived on the outside of that cage. He was loud, where she was controlled, messy, where she was polished, and visibly flawed in ways she never had permission to be. That didn't corrupt her so much as expose what she had already been fighting internally. According to Bobby, when they were together in this period, Whitney allowed herself to be different. She cursed. She laughed from her gut. She argued. She pushed back, and no one rushed in to smooth her out. The relief that came with that freedom had a cost. The more Whitney tried to juggle the woman she was in private with the icon she was forced to be in public, the more tension built inside her. And tension, when it has nowhere healthy to go, looks for shortcuts. During the I'm Your Baby Tonight era, coverage in the press remained carefully sanitized. The articles focused on chart performance, new sounds, her style, her awards. Any whispers of trouble were softened or handled quietly. Years later, veteran music journalists would admit there was an unspoken agreement between major labels and big media outlets. The rule was simple: protect the brand, especially when the brand was Whitney Houston. Negative stories weren't non-existent. They were delayed, softened, redirected. If she was late to a rehearsal, it became exhaustion. If she cancelled an appearance, it became much-needed rest. If her mood shifted, it was framed as maturity or artistic stress. Almost no one with power wanted to ask if she was actually struggling. Asking would mean acknowledging risk to a multi-million-dollar image. That silence had consequences. It left Whitney isolated in a crowd. When everyone around you insists you're fine because they need you to be fine, your pain doesn't disappear. It turns inward. Bobby has said that during this time, Whitney often confessed frustrations, not about performing itself, but about the impossibility of making a mistake. He described moments where she felt watched, even in supposedly private spaces, moments where she never felt fully off. Meanwhile, Bobby's own issues continued to explode in public. His arrests, temper, and unpredictability made him an easy villain. Whitney's growing internal battle, by contrast, stayed hidden not because it wasn't there, but because the system made sure it stayed off the record. This imbalance created a vacuum. And vacuums in celebrity culture don't stay empty. They fill up with guesses. By late 1991, whispers were circulating through industry corridors. Crew members noticed mood swings. Others noticed a kind of fatigue that sleep didn't fix. Some saw more defensiveness, sharper edges in private conversations. But almost no one connected those signs in any public way. To do so would require asking the kinds of questions no one wanted on the record. Bobby Brown later described this period as emotionally confusing. On one hand, he felt closer to Whitney than anyone else, seeing sides of her the public never would. On the other, he sensed she was carrying something heavy she'd been trained all her life to hide. He admitted that his own addiction made him a fragile anchor at best. He never painted himself as a hero, only as someone who recognized symptoms he already knew too well. This is the hidden tension of 1991. Whitney Houston was not collapsing in public. She was holding herself together in private at a cost few people understood. The gap between who she was allowed to be and who she actually was kept stretching wider. If drugs were present in her life at that time, they weren't pure rebellion. They were a coping tool, destructive but understandable, inside the pressure chamber she lived in. The tragedy is that the system around her was designed to reward silence. As long as she sang on cue, no one pressed further. As long as the charts looked good, concern could wait. Bobby's insistence that Whitney's struggles predated their romance doesn't erase his responsibility. But it does challenge the industry's favorite myth that everything was fine until one wrong man showed up. The more unsettling truth is this: Whitney Houston was carrying an impossible weight into the early 90s, and that weight was already becoming unbearable. Bobby Brown did not create that burden. He collided with it, and in that collision both of them lost balance. By the end of 1991, the public saw only a star on the rise. Behind closed doors, the fault line between image and reality had grown deep and unstable. The good girl was still smiling. The truth inside was getting louder. No one with the power to truly intervene decided to listen. And that silence, manufactured, protected, and paid for, would shape everything that came next. Marriage violence and controlled chaos, 1992-2006. This is the point in the story where the tone shifts. The fairy tale doesn't simply crack its buckles in real time. The date is July 18, 1992. The place is Mendham, New Jersey. A private estate wedding, white chairs on a lawn, summer heat hanging in the air. When Whitney Houston and Bobby Brown say "I do," the applause feels genuine, but so does the uneasiness sitting just beneath it. This is not the beginning of the damage. It is the moment the damage becomes permanent. In the early days, the marriage runs hot and fast. Arguments blow up and cool down, only to spark again. Doors slam. Voices cut through the night. Mornings bleed into nights with no real boundary between performance and collapse. According to police records and court documents that would eventually surface, neighbors heard shouting more than once. Someone called 911. Officers showed up. Reports noted injuries. Statements were taken. And then almost every time life went back to normal. Bobby Brown has never tried to erase the violence. He has admitted losing control, acting out, being abusive. What he has pushed back against is the idea that all of the chaos was flowing in only one direction. In his version, this was a house where addiction fueled addiction, where tempers ignited faster than anyone could put them out, where love and harm became tangled so tightly that they were hard to separate. In that telling, neither of them was sober enough emotionally or chemically to stop the spiral once it began. The public, however, consumed a much simpler script. Headlines reduced everything to a single image: the bad husband destroying the good woman. It was a story that felt clean, moral, and easy to digest. Inside the house, the reality was uglier and less comfortable. Both were using. Both could be volatile. Both were trapped in a feedback loop. Stress triggered substances. Substances triggered conflict. Conflict deepened isolation, and isolation sent them back to substances. The chaos did not stay hidden forever. Over the years, more reports stacked up. Police logs referenced domestic incidents. Bobby was arrested. Charges appeared, then disappeared. Settlements were reached. Public statements were made. Silence returned. The pattern repeated: intervention without real consequence, presence without real change. This is where the deeper structure of the story reveals itself. According to Bobby, and echoed by longtime observers, almost no one with real power ever stepped in decisively. Not managers, not label executives, not the people who benefited most from Whitney Houston's ongoing ability to perform. By this point, Whitney was more than a woman. She was infrastructure, a touring machine, a catalog, a source of steady revenue for multiple companies. The cost of scandal was measured, and the math always seemed to come out the same way: containing the damage was cheaper than confronting it. So officers left. Lawyers negotiated. Publicists crafted statements. The machine absorbed the shock and rolled on. Inside the home, things became less stable, not more. Accounts from people who claimed to have visited during these years describe rooms that felt tense even when no one was talking. Sudden mood swings. Long stretches of isolation behind closed doors. A sense that normal rules had stopped applying. Friends who tried to intervene were pushed away. Staff rotated quickly. Trust thinned out. Rumors grew. Some appeared later in court filings and documentaries. Others remained whispers: stories of Whitney disappearing for days, of Bobby unraveling outside while Whitney retreated inside of substances, kept close, of paranoia creeping into ordinary moments. Not every detail can be proven, but the pattern that emerges is consistent: an environment out of control with no stable center. On stage, Whitney still delivered more often than not. Her voice, even when slightly frayed, was strong enough to sustain the illusion. Each powerful performance became another excuse to avoid intervening. She's fine, the industry told itself. Look at her sing. No one asked what it was costing her to stand upright under the lights. By contrast, Bobby's behavior became the public crisis. His arrests made easy headlines. His outbursts became late-night jokes. The imbalance hardened. Whitney's struggles stayed hidden behind closed doors, while Bobby's fell out into the street. That gap fed resentment inside the marriage. According to Bobby, it felt like being blamed for a fire that had been burning long before he walked into the house, while the person at the center of the structure was never allowed to admit just how much she was burning too. As the years passed, the marriage didn't calm. It calcified. Addiction deepened. Violence escalated. Moments of peace grew shorter and less frequent. The house became a closed circuit where outside feedback rarely penetrated. People who questioned what was happening were labeled disloyal or pushed aside. People who stayed learned not to ask too many questions. On message boards and in legal analysis, years later, commenters would point to this period as a textbook example of systemic failure: not just a bad relationship, but a ring of enablers, emotional, professional, and financial, who chose continuity over safety. The argument appears again and again: if Whitney Houston had been an unknown woman calling the police from a quiet house, the outcome would likely have been very different. Fame changed the rules of response. By the early 2000s, the damage was visible even through carefully managed appearances. Whitney's physical appearance shifted. Interviews became more defensive, more brittle. Cancellations stacked up. Bobby's life unraveled publicly. The marriage became a shorthand for dysfunction. And still, the decisive intervention never arrived. When the divorce finally came in 2007, it felt less like a turning point and more like a collapse from exhaustion. Years too late. Damage long since baked in. Bobby left. Whitney stayed. The public wanted to believe this was escape, the moment everything could be fixed. It wasn't. What followed may have been the cruelest twist of this chapter. Without Bobby, Whitney lost not just the chaos, but also the last person who had seen her unfiltered for years. She entered a phase of deeper isolation. Old friends were gone or kept at a distance. Trust had eroded. The carefully built system that once protected her image seemed unprepared to handle her decline out in the open. Bobby would later say that the divorce didn't end the damage. It just removed the scapegoat. Whitney's struggles now, without a convenient villain to absorb blame, became impossible to hide. Looking back, this era reads less like a love story gone wrong and more like a slow-motion disaster engineered by silence. Violence happened. Addiction raged. Warning signs piled up. And still, the machine chose to move forward. The most shocking detail isn't a single incident. It's the repetition, the calls, the reports, the visits, the statements, the way each alarm was acknowledged, just enough to keep going, then filed away. From 1992 to 2006, the system consistently chose delay. By the time the marriage ended, the damage had outlived the relationship. And as the camera metaphorically lingers on an empty house, one question hangs in the air. If so many people knew something was wrong for so long, why did it take 15 years for the collapse to be allowed to happen in public? The answer shapes everything that happens next. The Last Night at the Beverly Hilton, 2012. The pace slows here because the night itself feels slow, like time trying to resist what's coming. February 11, 2012. Grammy weekend in Los Angeles. At the Beverly Hilton Hotel, the lobby hums with familiar energy. Executives greet each other by first name. Champagne glasses clink. Photographers move in small packs, flashes popping. Music spills from open doors. The industry is busy celebrating itself in the same building where one of its brightest voices is about to slip away. A few floors above the noise room, 434, is quiet. Over the previous days, Whitney Houston had moved through Los Angeles as if trying to slip back into an old version of herself. Witnesses later described a voice that sounded strained, a body that looked tired, and moments where she seemed present but not entirely grounded. She attended rehearsals. She greeted familiar faces. She tried one more time to stand inside the role Whitney Houston in public. At some point that afternoon, the party downstairs continued, while the hallway outside room 434 stayed still. Then someone opened the door and the scene inside changed everything. Whitney Houston was found unresponsive in the bathtub. Emergency calls were made. Hotel staff and paramedics followed protocol. But by the time help reached her, it was already too late. The water had cooled. The room once filled with steam and noise had gone quiet. Later, the official explanation arrived in clinical language. The coroner ruled her death an accidental drowning with heart disease and cocaine use listed as contributing factors. On paper, the file was complete. In reality, almost nothing felt resolved. The question that would not go away was not just how she died, but how she could die like that alone, fragile, unprotected, during one of the most heavily staffed, tightly scheduled weekends in the entire music industry. Whitney Houston was not some unknown singer passing anonymously through a hotel. She was one of the most recognizable voices on earth, surrounded, at least in theory, by staff handlers and professionals. This is where Bobby Brown has drawn a firm, uncomfortable line in interviews. He has said repeatedly that in her final days, Whitney did not have the kind of medical oversight her condition warranted. Not a doctor closely monitoring her state. Not a trained, sober companion with clear authority to step in. Instead, she had what many stars have: people whose primary focus was timing, logistics, and appearances. Bobby has never described that night as a random accident that came out of nowhere. He has described it as the endpoint of years of physical strain, addiction, and emotional isolation, the moment when a weakened heart, a worn-down body, and a quiet room finally intersected. In his view, the bathtub was not the cause. It was the place where everything that had been building simply caught up. In the years since, investigators, journalists, and online communities have picked apart Whitney's final day in microscopic detail. They've asked who last saw her conscious, how long she was left alone, what protocols were in place, and why more protective measures weren't mandatory, given her history. Most of these discussions don't lean on conspiracy or secret plots. They focus on something far more mundane and disturbing: neglect that had started to look normal. Downstairs, the pre-Grammy celebration eventually paused as the news spread. Shock moved through the hotel. Phones lit up. Notifications went out worldwide. The industry responded with tribute performances, montage videos, carefully edited memories. Within hours, Whitney Houston was being reinstalled in the public imagination as a legend frozen in her most flawless moments, separated from the messy questions surrounding her final hours. For Bobby Brown, the news didn't hit as a headline. It hit as confirmation of a fear he said he had carried for years. What haunted him, he later explained, was not pure surprise. It was recognition. He had seen this pattern before: a vulnerable woman left alone at exactly the wrong time inside a system that kept assuming someone else was watching. 3 years later, that pattern would repeat in a way he could never escape. The tragedy that repeated: Bobby Christina, 2015. January 31, 2015. Roswell, Georgia. History echoed itself with a precision that felt almost cruel. Bobby Christina Brown, the only child of Whitney Houston and Bobby Brown, was found unresponsive in a bathtub. The similarities to her mother's death were so stark that many people refused to accept the reports when they first appeared. Water. Silence. Critical minutes that no one could account for. Bobby Christina was rushed to the hospital and placed in a medically induced coma. For months, her body occupied a space between life and death, kept alive by machines, while relatives argued over decisions, responsibilities, and access. Hope appeared in small flashes, then receded. On July 26, 2015, Bobby Christina Brown died. With her death, the idea that Whitney Houston's passing had been an isolated tragedy became impossible to sustain. The repetition was too sharp, too specific. This time, Bobby Brown's posture toward the public shifted. He was no longer trying to correct decades of narrative in real time. He sounded like a man carrying something heavier than reputation. When asked about the similarities between the two deaths, he returned to the same phrase again and again: the cycle. In his words, it was a chain that had never been broken, made up of addiction, unresolved trauma exposure, without real protection, and a kind of isolation that gets misread as independence, because the person is famous. He spoke about how Bobby Christina had grown up inside the aftermath of Whitney's struggles. She had been surrounded by adults, but rarely anchored by consistent stability. As always, rumors flared. Allegations about toxic relationships, harmful influences, and missed interventions filled comment sections and forums. Some claims were backed by legal documents. Others remained speculation. What mattered most was not which rumor proved true. It was that the environment allowed so many disturbing questions to exist at all. After losing his daughter, Bobby Brown stepped away from public fights. He went into therapy. He talked more openly about sobriety, regret, and responsibility, not in rehearsed sound bites, but in the language of someone finally looking at the full damage without looking away. He acknowledged his own failures. He stopped insisting they were the only failures that mattered. From those later reflections came something that sounded less like an excuse and more like a warning. He argued that fame creates a powerful illusion of safety while quietly erasing accountability, that when everyone assumes someone else is in charge of a star's well-being, no one actually is. That both Whitney Houston and Bobby Christina Brown died not because they were invisible, but because they were extremely visible and still left alone at crucial moments. 2 bathtubs, 3 years apart, 2 different states, 2 different sets of circumstances, linked by the same missing piece: protection someone could rely on. The repetition was too precise to ignore. It forced a reckoning, not just with personal choices, but with the systems around them: the labels, the handlers, the friends, the family structures, the media that normalized danger, as long as the image stayed profitable or inspiring. In the end, Bobby Brown stopped focusing on the question everyone had thrown at him for years. Were you to blame and started focusing on a harder one? How many warning signs can be ignored before tragedy stops being an accident and becomes routine? The answer written across both of these deaths is chilling in its simplicity. Everyone thought someone else would step in. No one did. This is the part no tribute montage ever says out loud. Whitney Houston did not simply die suddenly. Bobby Christina did not simply die unexpectedly. They died after years of visible warning signs in rooms full of history and empty of responsibility. Fame did not shield them. Love on its own did not save them. Silence finished what addiction started. Bobby Brown's final truth is not a plea for absolution. It is an accusation aimed at something larger than himself. Because when so many people saw the danger and still looked away, the tragedy stopped being just personal. It became systemic. So the real question is no longer what happened to them. The real question is, who will be next and who will pretend not to see it coming? If you know someone whose life or personality mirrors this story, share their name in